Okay, well, it's 11 o'clock. Let's listen to the talk of, from Bosscher. He's going to talk about Django Admin. First to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. Last year there was a talk from Reinhard van Rees, I think. It was an introduction to the Django Admin. I'd like to think of my talk as a kind of follow-up as that. This is a talk about the Django Admin for people who've read the documentation, worked a little bit with it, want to do a little bit more with it. If you have 10 years of experience with Django, you might find a few cool tricks, but not that many. But if you worked with it for like 2 or 3 years, this is probably the talk for you. As I mentioned before, my name is Bosscher. I'm a software engineer at Target Holding. In Target Holding, we specialize in big data. And the project I mostly work on is called DeathGap. It's a company here in Groningen in the Netherlands, and they make exams for the primary schools education and secondary schools education. And it's one of the smaller projects we have. I think we have around 1.5 million exam results and stuff like that. For us as a company, it's a really small project. I think our biggest database is about 2 terabytes now. But it's the kind of project which is big enough to be really interesting, and it's small enough to not have the kind of scaling problems you can have with Django, as for example Instagram has, where at some point everyone had to remember the user ID of Justin Bieber. We don't have to do stuff like that, so that's pretty cool. Okay, so the purpose of this talk is not to tell you everything about the Django Admin, because I only have like 30 minutes. The purpose is also not to tell you what you can read in the documentation. The purpose is really to tell you how you can start by trying to understand the Django Admin source code. I'll tell you what kind of classes are interesting. I'll tell you what kind of functions are interesting. I'll tell you where to get started, give you some cool tips as well. And I hope that the next time that you're faced with a problem, and if you're thinking, well, should I solve it using the Django Admin or some other tool, that you know a little bit better where you can get started with taking a look if the Django Admin is suited for your use case. So the best place to start trying to understand the Django Admin is, of course, django.contrib.admin on GitHub. But the moment that you open this on GitHub, you get a very long list of all kinds of files, and it's really impossible to know where you can get started with that. Some of the files have very innocent sounding names, like options.py. There is a views folder which contains only 2 files, none of them which are really views. So not the best place to get started. The Django Admin kind of has a reputation for being confusing, Django's monster in the closet, being full of dragons and stuff like that. I really don't think that's true anymore. The Django Admin has improved a lot in the past few versions. We still work a lot with Django 1.8. I based this talk on Django 1.11, and they cleaned up a lot of the code. It's a lot easier to understand. It's a lot easier to work with as well. There are quite a few hooks for customization if you are careful. A lot of the advice that you get if you start working with Django and with the admin is that the moment that you try to do something custom, you're better off doing it with a custom view. And often that's true. Sometimes that's not true. But if you want to implement a custom view, it helps to know where the hooks are, because you do not have to replace everything. Very often you're better off just replacing a single part and getting all the results you want, but still having some of the benefit of the Django admin. So the best way to get started is actually in your project itself. If you open your urls.py, and this is the one from the Django Pulse tutorial, you see that at some point you're going to include the Django admin. It's usually included at admin, and you can see that it references Django contrib admin sites URLs. So if you take a look at that, you see that it's a file on GitHub as well. It's about 400 lines, and it's very, very readable. It's a good place to get started if you want to understand the Django admin. If you open the file, you first get like a really complicated class. You can read through it. And then at the end of the file, it mentions that site references to an instance of this class. And it's interesting to know that this is not a singleton. You can register multiple admins in Django, and it will work perfectly. It's not an issue at all. This also contains the index, which is a nice method to get started if you want to customize your admin a little bit more, if you want to add some context data. It also contains the password change, the password reset functions, the login and the logout function as well. Good to know is that this class contains an underlined register. You register your models. This is where they end up. So if you want to customize the index of your admin, and if you want to know where all the apps are and all the models, this is where you're going to find them. It also contains the action register, which contains all the actions in your Django admin. And if you don't know what actions are these things up top. And just a small tip that I can give you, by default, Django registers only one action, and it's delete everything that's selected. You know, in our case, we more often had problems with users deleting too much than we had with users deleting too little. You can deregister this action, and it actually gives you a much nicer layout by default. So that's just a quick tip I want to give you. It's literally a one-liner. It can prevent quite a few problems with users being a little bit too overzealous in deleting stuff. You get a nicer layout by default. And you can still enable it in views if there is some view where you do want users to delete multiple things. Well, adding views to the Django admin is probably the first thing you want to do if you want to start customizing it. And it's really quite easy to do. There's a getURLs method, which returns a bunch of URL patterns. And that's a perfect place to add your URL pattern. There's a view called admin view, and you can use that to wrap your own views so that you can still get permission checking. You would have to implement the permission checking, of course, yourself in the custom views. But do not forget to do that, because otherwise the view is just available for everyone. As I mentioned before, there's an index method, and it returns a template response. And the nice thing about template responses in Django is that they contain everything you need to render a template, but the template is not yet rendered. So if you just extend this class, call the super in this method, and then modify the context a little bit, or change the template, but there are better ways to change the template, you can quite easily add a little bit of custom stuff. You know, stuff like showing the current amount of visitors on the website or stuff like that. It's just a really small change to do, but it's often quite useful for users to do. And if you do it using this method, it only costs you like a few lines of code, and you get a pretty big benefit. There's also a method called def_each_context, and it returns a dictionary of variables to put in every view in your admin. So if you have something like a bookmark or stuff like that that you want to make available to every view, this will be the place where you could put it. Now, the next file you probably want to take a look at is Django contrib admin options. And it's a very, very innocent sounding file. Like options, you don't really expect a lot to be in there, except it contains pretty much everything of the Django admin, including the kitchen sink. If they had one, they would probably put it in there. The file is about 2K of lines, and most of that is just contained by one class, the ModelAdmin. And you know, trying to understand that without knowing where to look at first is quite daunting. There's a lot of stuff contained in the ModelAdmin. It contains a few things that are really specific to the admin as well. So if you're quite familiar with Django, you're probably going to be confused by some of the terms they use, because they're really close to the kind of stuff you would use when writing your own views, but they might be a tiny little bit different. And of course, the best way to get started is to take a look at the getURLs as well. And you can see quite clearly that there are 5 views contained in there. The change list, and add, and history, a change, and delete view. And knowing this, it's a bit easier to understand. 2,000 of lines for 5 views is 400 lines for each view. That's not really true, but it makes it a bit easier to get started. And the first thing I want to draw some attention to is the change list. And the change list is the thing that you will see when you open a model in the Django admin. So you can see it is the screen where you just get a list of all the objects in there. And it's called a change list because you can make some of the files, some of the fields editable. We don't really use it in our project. I don't really see it used quite a lot in the world, but that is where the name change list comes from. Quite logical. This initializes the change list, the edits. You can replace this entire function to implement your own custom change list. You can also extend the change list class to combine multiple query sets, do fancy thing, have 2 change lists on your page, but I would really, really not recommend doing that. The class is quite easy to understand, but it changes quite a lot, and especially if you still want to support the editable functionality, it's going to be a lot of work for not a lot of benefit. If you want to change the page that you can see here, you're probably better off just writing it yourself or doing some concessions when it comes to usability, and perhaps not including all the fancy functionality that you would like to have, but just settling for like 80%. It also contains all the logic for the filters, the ordering, date hierarchy, and the search. So if you want to replace or extend one of those things, there will be the place where you could start looking at that. The filters are pretty easy to understand. One of the nice things that you can do if you actually start reading the class, one thing that you discover is that you can implement a filter also as a query string. So if you, for example, open something in the admin and you add name, underline, underline, I contains is target, it will work. So you do not have to define the filters as a list filter. And this has been quite useful for us. We've had quite a few cases where users would mail us, where they would need some kind of management information that wasn't available through the list filters at first. And we would make a query, and we would export a CSV or an Excel sheet. They would send it back to them, then it would send it back to us, and they would tell us that there was one column missing, and would update it, and would send it to them again. It was all in a lot of hassle. So if it is possible, we just copy and paste the arguments that you would use for the filter function, and most of the time it actually works surprisingly well. And you can send them a link, and they can just look through it. If they need any extra information, they know where to find it. If they want to change something, they know that they're editing the right object. So it's just a nice little trick that you will discover quite soon if you start taking a look at the Django Admin. Also good to know is that this contains the pagination class, and the pagination class does a count the moment you open the list view, the change list view, and this is often quite an expensive query. We have a few tables where we're over 1 million records, and doing a count on the table with over 1 million records is not something that's quite fast. All the views in the Django admin are not cached by default, so that also causes quite a bit of a performance hit. In our case, we managed to replace it by an approximately count function that takes a look at the statistics in the database, the same statistics that the query analyzer uses, and that solved the problem for us. So there's a different solution that you need for your project. This is the place where you could start taking a look at, and if you could start optimizing it. Also, another quite useful function on the change list is the get URL for results. This is a function we use quite intensively. As you can see, you get the result in there. So you can just check the object, you can check the status, and you can do routing to a different URL based on the status. We use it, for example, in the way we handle orders. Someone places an order, then we check if a school is connected to the order. If a school is not connected to the order and someone opens it in the admin, we redirect them to a custom view where they first have to connect the school to the order, and then they can accept or deny or change something in the order. It's quite useful to have. We also work a lot with polymorphic models. And utilizing this function, you can make sure that you revert it to the original admin and not to the kind of thing it wants to revert to default. Okay, the other thing, the next function I want to take a look at is the add and change view. And if you start taking a look at the URLs of PyPy, the add and change view both redirect to the change form view. So they're practically the same, which is very nice for us because if we understand one function, we understand the rest of it. And the change form view also returns a template response. It is really quite easy to extend. You can do some validation there. You can implement a custom view, form there as well. And you can think of the add and the change view as a kind of form view. They're pretty much similar to how you would implement them yourself. It's just a function. I think it's around 200 lines, so it's pretty easy to read. Might be a bit less structured than you would use with your normal functions, but still, I highly recommend taking a look at it. The downside is that it's pretty hard to extend. It uses a model form factory, so it's pretty easy to understand, but there's no way to override the default arguments or to pass your own quarks to it, which makes it a bit tougher to extend this function. So if you want to do something nice and fancy with the standard forms that Django give, I would suggest taking a look at the default options you have in the admin, which are quite extensive. If you take a look at the documentation, you can see that you can replace it. But changing the default form is not something I would really recommend. In our case, it's often better to just alter our own custom form, do our own custom validation, which you can do quite easily utilizing the render change form method, for example, and working on that. Another nice function to take a look at, which is not something you're going to discover quite quickly in the admin because it's not a very interesting function, but which is quite interesting to take a look at, is the initial data for the change form view. And if you take a look at there, you can see that you actually can pass default arguments as a get URL parameter, which has been quite useful for us. We have a lot of views where we, for example, give user the possibility to directly add a teacher to a school. And it helps if you can pre-fill the information, because a lot of schools in our application have quite similar names. Something like the Einstein school is something that you can see quite often. At the moment you add the teacher to a wrong school, the teacher has access to all the personal information of the students of a wrong school. And that's something you really, really want to prevent. And automatically pre-filing information like this really, really helps users to avoid this kind of mistakes. As you can see, it's really quite easy to add, and it's a very nice addition to have. Another nice helper function to take a look at is the DeathGap object, because it returns the object. We utilize this function sometimes to add a little bit more of information to the object, because you get the object, you can add some information to it if you want to, and then return it. In some cases, you want to add that kind of information to your model, so that's available everywhere. In some cases, you kind of have this. You only need this kind of information in the admin. And in that case, this function is a quite useful place to add that. Another nice function to take a look at, which you probably all know if you worked before with the Django Admin, is the getQueryStep method. It's good to mention it here. This is the place where you can, for example, add a select related, a prefetch related, do some extra filtering, stuff like that. It's good to know that it exists if you didn't know that, but you guys probably all do that. If you worked a little bit more with the Django Admin, you probably know that you cannot register a model twice. The moment I started with Django Admin, one of the first things I did was try to register a model twice, add a filter to the getQueryStep method, and I thought it would work, but it doesn't. So if you want to get two views of the same model, the best way to do it is to implement a proxy model, and then you can still add filters, but it's not exactly the same for Django Admin. The next view I want to spend a little bit more of time on is the history view. Django comes with quite an extensive logging system built in, but not a lot of people know that. You might have seen this view if you clicked on the view history. It's usually in the top right corner. And it shows you a nice list of all the changes that have been made to an object, the user that made that change, and the moment when it was changed. It's a really, really nice addition to have, and you get it pretty much for free. We use it quite a lot to debug some weird issues. For example, you get user A who changes something, then user B changes it back, and then they both open a bug report because it doesn't work as expected. Using the history view, you can easily debug this kind of stuff. You can see who changed at what time, and usually you can see what kind of fields they changed. You can't see exactly what kind of information they changed. It would be a nice addition, but that kind of makes it a bit bigger as well. We also spiced it up a little bit because it's quite easy to extend this function. We use it, for example, to see when exam results are thrown away, so a user can do the same exam twice, or if a recalculation is done for the same exam. Well, the functions that you can use to extend this are the log addition, log change, log deletion. They're really quite useful and quite easy to understand. There are also good functions to get started if you want to understand a little bit more about how the Django log entry system works. It's pretty basic. It's just a Django model, so it's pretty basic to extend. But if you want to see how Django uses it internally, take a look at these methods. Of course, the method for the history view itself is pretty basic and quite understandable as well. And it also returns a template response. So if you want to add a little bit more of information, spice it up a little bit, this would be the place to do that. Also good to know is that you can pretty easily register the log entry model in the admin, and you can just make it a normal admin layout of it. You get a really nice overview of all the actions that have happened on your Django admin side. So you get a nice overview of when objects are added, deleted, or edited. You can see who did it, at what moment. It's pretty easy to add filters as well. We filter, for example, on all the users who did that. Add a bit of search functionality, and it gives you a very nice overview. Can be quite useful in debugging issues on production. And it's literally 5 lines of code. Well, then we come to the delete view, and it's really quite straightforward. It is pretty much exactly what you would expect from a delete view. You get a nice overview, which you probably already know, about all the objects that are going to be deleted. It checks all the relationships, makes a nice list of it. The delete view itself is, of course, delete view. And it returns a template response object as well. We haven't felt the need to change this. The moment that you do want to implement something like a soft delete or an archive function or something like that, you're probably way better off placing it on the model itself. But if you want to give a little bit more information about the impact of what the kind of impact that the delete action is going to have for your users, this would be the place to take a look at. Then I want to take a short look at layout customization, because that's really quite easy to do. The Django Admin templates can be a bit intimidating at first because they're quite information dense, but they're surprisingly easy to work with. If you just poke a little bit at the right places, you can check the results quite easy, and it just takes a little bit of time before you understand the Django names for all the admin things. But as soon as you do, it is really quite easy to do. The only things that you really need to be aware of is that a form contains a form line and form fields. A form line is the thing you would use if you define a field set in the admin, and you can just group multiple fields together. Well, it gets added to a form line. The moment you render a form line, you render the fields that are inside the form line. It's pretty easy, just one little nice touch that you need to know. It's fairly safe to do as well. The Django HTML templates for the admin don't really change that much. They changed the styling in 1.8, but they did all of that using CSS. The JavaScript changes a bit more for some reason. There's quite a lot of development going on there, but the HTML so far has proven to be quite safe to change and to extend. There's also the media class, because very often changing the templates, modifying the templates is a bit of overkill. If you want to do small changes, change the layout a little bit, make a field a bit bigger, a bit smaller, stuff like that, you can do that really easily. And this is also documented, by the way, by adding a class media, adding a CSS or JS attribute to that, and defining what kind of CS you want Django to include by default. As you can see, you can also mention for what kind of media queries this needs to be implemented. And all in all, it's pretty easy to do. In most cases, this works pretty well for us. Cases where you want to be a bit more fancy, take a look at the templates. We have a really nice mix-in that we use quite a lot to allow for multi-column layouts in the Django admin, because at some point, if you implement a lot of information on a model, it just gets longer and longer and longer. At some point, it's really not useful anymore. We went through a few iterations to make this possible. I think our first solution was a monkey patch, which somehow output a list, which worked okay for us. But every time that someone added an inline or changed something in the field set, it would all break. And at some point, we kind of had like conditional inlines. So if someone has some kind of special permission, they would get an extra inline, and everything would break again. After a few iterations, we managed to solve it by this. I'll just walk you through the code really quickly. We extend the render_change_form method, and we built a field set dig where we use the name of the field set. We run it through a slugify function, of course, and we replace the normal dots with an underline, just to make it easier for ourselves. And we add that to the context, admin form. So in the template, you can just access the form, and then you can access the field sets. Then you can loop through them and render them as you want, in the certain column where you want to, or in the order where you would like to have them. And we do the same thing for the inline admins. As you can see, we look through the inline admins which are contained in the context. It's in the inline admin form set, which is quite a descriptive name, I would say. We built a dictionary of that as well, and we added to the context as inline admin form set by name. And then we just go on with the normal rendering. And that results in a template kind of like this, where you can just extend, for example, the change form. We did that. We take the block field set, and we just replace the entire block. We don't call the super of the block. We just implement everything in columns. Well, we do some very basic and ugly CSS inline styling, which is very popular in the JavaScript community, so we were hip, And then we do stuff like that. With field is admin form field set schoolgegevens, which is quite descriptive. Include this template. And then the templates get rendered with the schoolgegevens. And we do the same thing for inlines as well. This this has worked quite well for us, because even if you add something, it just doesn't get rendered by default, but it doesn't break any of the existing stuff. If you use conditionals or stuff like that, this is just going to resolve to nothing, and it's just not going to be rendered. And it still doesn't break the admin. You can do all the cool Django normal templating logic in there. You can make it really quite easy, and it really makes it quite easy to do multiple columns layout. And then we have no signal for some reason. It's just a case of turning it off and on again, apparently. Also works for Linux. Okay. Another thing I want to draw attention to, which is mentioned in the docs, but which is not used a whole lot, are the admin docs. Let me first show them to you. That's a bit easier. Django actually contains a documentation browser by default. It's just not enabled by default, which is a bit of a weird choice. I think they did it because you have to install an extra dependency. But if you do that, it's really easy to add it. You get a nice overview of all the views you have. You get a nice overview of all the models. You even get a nice overview of all the template tags, which are normally a bit harder to find, especially to get an overview of. It gives you a nice overview of the doc strings as well. And adding it is just a case of adding the Django Contract admin docs to your installed apps, adding the URLs to the URLs from Py, and installing the optional Python module. And that's pretty much all you have to do. Of course, it's not as fancy as some of the other documentation browsers. For example, you do not get a search functionality, which is something that you really enjoy having. But it has been useful for us in a few times where you were, for example, working at the customer, and you needed to have a little bit more information about the certain models, or just a little bit of documentation, so you could build a nice query string and just give them the result they needed to have right there at that moment. In that case, this worked quite well. It supports Markdown, which is very nice. And it also supports links to, for example, models, views, stuff like that. So you can link in the doc strings to other stuff, and it gets picked up automatically. Pretty easy to add. As I mentioned before, it is 2 lines and 1 dependency. So add it. That's it. Questions?